universal set of rules. Having agreed to call themselves the Football Association, an impasse was reached. The supporters of the Rugby Code opposed any law which might prevent handling or hacking, a bone of contention for those who wanted to see a kicking game. The deadlock was broken on the 8th of December, when hacking and handling were banned. It was a decision which left football with two codes: association football and rugby. Yet even after the Football Association was formed, the rules of the game were flexible.
Many people misunderstand the development of the game. They think that in 1863, the Football Association was founded, a set of rules was created, and that was it. That wasn't it. If you asked a player in the 1860s or 1870s, are you a football or a rugby player, they probably would have said, I'm sorry, I don't understand, what are you talking about? Because it was quite common for teams to play association in the first half of the game, to play rugby in the second half of the game. You agreed the rules on a match-by-match basis. You could have 10, 11, 12, 14, 16, 20, as many players as the other team agreed.
Such confusion was never more pronounced than when teams from England met teams from Scotland. Queen's Park, the Scots' greatest side, had pioneered a game which involved passing the ball between players, a style the English chose to dismiss.
The English tended to, it was more, you could see more vestigial traces of rugby, I think, in the way that English players played. The English players, when they played Queen's Park, were very keen that hacking should be kept, deliberate kicking of the shins. There is a letter from Lord Kinnaird to Queen's Park arranging a friendly and saying, let's have hacking, it's such fun, which depended on what end of the hack you were at, I think.
For the public school boys, football was a pastime, not a sport. As a consequence, the game lacked continuity, passion, drama. Football needed a visionary, someone who could take its essence and mould it into something irresistible.
Charles Alcock is one of the most influential men in the start of football, was a boy at Harrow. Indeed, he was a boy at Drury's House, one of the houses playing here today. And when he left Harrow, he was instrumental in organising the Football Association. And he actually invented and started the FA Cup, which is based on the inter-house Harrow football.
First played in 1871, the FA Cup is the world's oldest football tournament.
The importance of the FA Cup is pretty clear. What it does is establish the really key element of competition and knockout nature of that competition as a way forward for football. And indeed, what happens in the World Cup now, what happens in the European League now, what happens in any number of worldwide and regional competitions. It's the knockout competitions that really catch the eye and draw the crowds.
The success of the FA Cup persuaded Charles Alcock to arrange the first ever international match. On St Andrew's Day 1872, 4,000 people gathered to watch the home side, Scotland, take on England. With no previous example to draw on, the match proved somewhat makeshift.
How did you know how to dress up for a game? It was the first international game. So the English players, they had white shirts with the 3 rampant lions on, but that was it. They played in the colours of the schools that they had played for. So we have knowledge that some players were Old Etonians, some players were Old Harrovians, and they were playing in red or red and white, because of course in those days it hadn't occurred to people that if you all wore the same strip, it made identification on the field easier. Although I will say that even at that game, the English wore caps, the Scots wore cowls, the sort of hood you would get on an anorak, because it hadn't occurred to either team that heading the ball was a useful thing to do in football.
England began the match with 8 attackers and dribbled with the ball. Scotland fielded 6 forwards and passed the ball between themselves. A revolutionary tactic which would have a profound impact on world football.
It's not important because it was the first game, because that's a statistical freak. It's important because you had 2 cultures clashing in the one game, and the dominant culture, the successful culture, the Scottish passing and running culture, being taken back through those English players. And that is why that game is the most important game ever played in the history of world football.
Almost all of the first international players were public schoolboys, a reflection of the total dominance wielded by the upper classes over football. For soccer to emerge as the world game, it would first have to become the people's game. Apostles were needed, energetic men who could spread the game to the working classes.
The church was important in sending out its young missionaries, its curates, its vicars, its Sunday school teachers, to persuade large numbers of working people to follow, working men, to follow the game which they themselves enjoyed. That cult of muscular Christians, of young men who were steeped in Christian faith but believed that physical activity, best expressed through team sports, was the way young men ought to play and express themselves. And what better, what cheaper, what easier way of developing a sport than football, the easiest game in the world to play.
Football spread throughout the country, although it was in the industrial north, a working class stronghold, that the game really took off.
I think industrialisation is absolutely vital. It's very hard to imagine a mass sporting culture developing in a non-industrial culture at that time. Above all, it's an industrial culture which provides the regularity of wages and the structure of the week, the working week, with clear breaks for leisure time, which allows the game to emerge. There's no coincidence that in counties like Lancashire that you can begin to see the working class popular teams emerge almost at the moment at which the Saturday half holiday is granted.
The half-day Saturday liberated thousands of men from the drudgery of work and created an environment in which football could rapidly expand. As a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, its significance to football was only marginally more important than the coming of the railways.
The railways are hugely important. You could not have national league structures without railways. The notion of football teams travelling the length and breadth of the country, to a lesser extent supporters travelling the length and breadth of the country, is just impossible without the railways.
Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, football was parasitic, feeding off the growth in industry and technology. As a result, new clubs sprang up throughout England, absorbing players and administrators.
The teams that emerge in the 1880s and 1890s, and many of them household names today, emerge from a number of institutions that already exist. It's men meeting in a pub and deciding they'd like to form a football club, football team. It's men in the place of work, Arsenal, the Woolwich Arsenal, deciding that they'd like to play. It's men in, let's say, a railway company, Manchester United, North Manchester Railway. It's groups of working men in the institutions they belong to, the church, the Sunday school, the trade union, the place of work, the pub, all the institutions that are basic to working class life, spawn the new football clubs. That's how the clubs, so many of which we know today, in professional form, that's where they emerge from.
At first, most clubs were nomadic. Settled one day, uprooted the next. But when more and more fans began arriving at matches, clubs such as Aston Villa were forced to find a permanent home.
Well, Villa, they rent a pitch from a butcher for £5 per annum, and the butcher soon realises that he's got something on his hands, because he raises the rent to £8 per annum the following year.